Typically as a church, we're teaching through books of the Bible. In fact, today we're resuming our study in Galatians, and we are going to be doing that. But what we don't do as a church typically is, I'll just speak personally for me. As a pastor, I'm typically not, getting up Monday morning and reading the newspaper and deciding what to talk about the next Sunday based on what's happening in the news or what's in the current news feed. We tend to teach through Scripture, line by line, and what we find is that the passages almost always speak in relevant ways to what's happening in our world and in our nation. And so it's pretty rare that we just stop and pause and talk about what's happening in the political arena or in the in society in a kind of a topical way. But I've been encouraged to do that this morning by some, and especially by my wife, who has great influence over me, and just to talk about what's so over the last few weeks we've seen this thing playing out with the Supreme Court making a decision to reverse Roe v. Wade, and that is a momentous occurrence in our nation. It's something that many have been longing for, contending for, hoping for, praying for. And there's others who are very concerned about the implications of that and are responding with fear and all of that. And so what I'd like to do this morning is just share, I've actually written down my thoughts because I think this is a topic. I actually spent most of yesterday just typing out some what I've labeled pastoral thoughts on abortion and being pro-life following the Supreme Court's overturning of Roe v. Wade. And I qualify this by saying these are pastoral thoughts. So that means I have one perspective. I have my perspective, and I have my sphere of influence, which is seeking to pastor one corner of God's pasture, is the way I like to think about it. And that God has given me a stewardship of influence. I would say leadership is a stewardship of influence for the sake of others. It comes out of David's calling, where David realized that he had been established with influence in the nation of Israel, but his influence was not for his own sake, it was for the sake of the people. And so what I'd like to share is from some pastoral thoughts that I would say this is for the sake of the people. What would I say about this, the moment that we live in, which is a very significant time, very significant things happening, and significantly divisive for many. So what is we as a church, what's our posture towards that? So this is not comprehensive. These are not the thoughts of a politician. They're not the thoughts of a medical practitioner. They're not the thoughts of a scientist or an activist. And without maybe stating the obvious, they're not the thoughts of a woman. They're my thoughts from my perspective as a pastor. And so I'm going to actually just read these, and with the heart to say, come Holy Spirit, would you show us how to be your people in this moment, how to carry your name faithfully. In the wake of the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe v. Wade, I've been having many conversations, mostly with members of our church, but also with strangers and with people on the street. And what has become even more evident to me through these conversations and emails as well is that the issues surrounding abortion are highly complex, and that the opinions, beliefs, and feelings that people have on the topic are passionately held. I've heard many people's personal stories and experiences that have shaped their views on abortion and the ruling of the Supreme Court. Stories that put a face on the complexity of abortion and pregnancy in this still fallen world. We live in a world of now and not yet. What I'm seeing is that people's perspective on what is currently happening is a mixture of theological convictions, political views, shaping influences, and experiential stories. We don't just come at it with one angle or from one perspective. There's a mixture of all of these influences that shape the way we come to this. People say things like, this happened to me, or I know a woman, or I talked to a woman who's suffered through this. I've also come to see that there is a proclivity in our world to vilify and to demonize people who think differently on this issue. That happens on both sides, which just creates more problems because once we vilify and label someone, it becomes much easier to justify treating them with contempt and disdain. Having judged their motives, we find it easier to shout them down, tune them out, or dismiss their concerns. I've seen this dynamic playing out not only in the culture at large, but also amongst self-professing Christians as well, many of whom are wrestling with what is the most loving response to the complex issues surrounding pregnancy and abortion in our world. Most Christians, at least in my experience and in the circles I travel in, most Christians hold to the sanctity of life and to the intrinsic value of every single person as an image bearer of God. Most Christians have therefore wanted to see abortion on demand greatly reduced, if not eliminated. But there is not consensus over how to then deal with all the realities of unplanned pregnancies that gave rise to abortion in the first place. So for example, I've just tried to put a face on the issue, and much of this comes from conversations I've had in talking with people and hearing people's concerns, hearing people's hopes. But what are the complexities that originated or gave rise to abortion in the first place? So for example, how do we reduce unplanned pregnancies to begin with? I'm using the language of unplanned pregnancies because typically planned pregnancies are wanted pregnancies, are pregnancies that are not a crisis. They're pregnancies where a couple is desiring to bring a new child into this world. So I'm using the language of unplanned pregnancies because oftentimes those are the ones that can be a crisis. So how do we reduce unplanned pregnancies to begin with? How do we solve the tension? And by we, I mean followers of Jesus. How do we solve the tension of believing that abstinence is God's design until marriage with the reality of a culture that does not share that belief or practice? And to be honest, we don't do that well with it ourselves. Do we encourage or discourage the use of contraceptives and birth control for anyone who is sexually active but not wanting to become pregnant? And if we prefer birth control and contraceptives to unplanned pregnancies, are those items available and affordable? Are they free to those who are poor? How do we teach boys and men to be responsible for their part in not creating unplanned pregnancies in the first place? And to be fully committed to sharing the responsibilities and the repercussions of unplanned pregnancies that do occur? I have a whole category here of financial costs that are factors that often drive women to consider ending a pregnancy. How do we address the financial costs that have driven some women to want to end an unplanned pregnancy? What do we say to the women who have no insurance or cannot afford the exorbitant cost of their deductibles and copays? If a single woman keeps her pregnancy, how do we help her address her future needs for childcare and for suitable employment once her baby's born? How do we help a young woman keep her pregnancy and continue her education so that she and her children do not become trapped in lifelong poverty? What do we do with the medical costs and the lifelong expenses of keeping the pregnancy of a child with severe medical problems or disabilities? How do we make adoption more affordable for the families who would be thrilled to welcome these now unaborted children into their homes and families? I spoke with a friend this week whose family is in the process of pursuing an adoption, not internationally, domestically, has been pursuing an adoption for 3 years, and they're already 3 years and almost $10,000 into the process and still don't have a child. That's got to change if we want there to be a home for children that were unplanned or whose families can't keep them. Here's another category. How do we respond to the mental and emotional trauma of a woman whose pregnancy is the result of rape, incest, or coercion? How do we help them with the additional psychological trauma of carrying a child conceived under those circumstances? And how do we treat women with dignity, compassion, and tenderness when they reveal what they have endured? How do we help the woman trapped in an abusive relationship who would rather end her pregnancy than to bring a child into that abusive environment? How do we help the young woman who never had a healthy family herself and is terrified that she won't be able to provide one for her child? Another category. How do we deal with the harsh realities faced by children who are brought into a home where they are unwanted? How do we address the abuse, the neglect, and the severe poverty that can result from an unplanned or unwanted pregnancy? What do we say to the person whose painful childhood has brought them to the place of saying that they wish that they had been aborted? And how do we help the woman filled with fear and shame because she's not able to adequately protect and provide for the children she already has? These are only some of the questions and circumstances that contribute to the complexity of pregnancy and abortion. The legislation that is being passed by our federal and state governments only addresses the availability of abortion as a legal option. It does not answer all these questions, nor provide for all these situations. As a result, the legislation will be efficient in lowering the numbers of abortion in our nations, but it will not be effective in addressing the reasons that women have considered or chosen abortions. Sadly, some of the ripples of this change in legislation will be pain-filled lives for the very children it rescues. And if the underlying issues are not addressed, abortion will not go away, it will go underground. And there will be even more violent, more dangerous, and more costly. And that's the limit of the law. Laws can put boundaries in place that encourage us to do some things while discouraging us from doing others. But laws do not and cannot fully address the condition of the human heart and the painfulness of a human economy and the human experience that would cause a mother to consider ending her pregnancy. Although we're doing something a little different than Galatians, actually the place we're in Galatians right now is contrasting the effectiveness of law versus grace. The limitations that law can only go so far. The first covenant was a covenant of law. The second covenant, the new covenant, is a covenant of grace. And the first covenant wasn't bad, it was just very limited in what it could do. The first covenant could reveal the brokenness of mankind, the brokenness of our hearts, the condition of our world, the things that we would do to one another, and it could put some parameters to limit the violence we might do to one another. It didn't change the heart that violence came from. It just leveraged our self-interest that don't do these things or you might be punished yourself. And so it curbs and restrains the violence we might do, but it doesn't change the condition of the human heart. This law is like that. It limits what we might do, but it doesn't address the heart that those come from or the circumstances that gave rise to that. Please hear me. I am not advocating for or justifying abortion. I am advocating for better understanding of a complex issue and of the people on the other side. All things being equal, I'm glad for the reversal of Roe v. Wade because I do believe in the intrinsic value of life. I believe that each and every person is a unique image bearer of the living God. And I believe in a creator who is the author of all life, regardless of the human circumstances in which it was conceived. Because of all that, I am deeply pro-life. But being pro-life must not stop at being anti-abortion. It must not stop at ensuring babies survive the womb. Being pro-life means a commitment to seek the wholeness, provision for, the safety, love, hope, justice, health, and opportunity for every living person, born and unborn, womb to tomb. The biblical word for all of that, there's a bucket word that encompasses all of that. It's the word shalom. God instructs those who worship him to seek the shalom of the people they live in the midst of. Seek the shalom of those who do not yet know him or worship him. Seek the shalom of those who have rejected or despised him. Jeremiah 29, God sends his people into exile in Babylon, which is the picture of the most godless people in the world at that time. People of violence, a people of idolatry. And God says, go and seek the shalom, the welfare, the wholeness, the peace, the prosperity, the abundance, peace between one another, peace between God and man. Seek the welfare of the city where I have placed you. For in its welfare, you will find your welfare. In its shalom, you'll find your shalom. God would call us as a church to not just contend for the end of abortion, but contend for the shalom of those who survive the womb. Because God, why is this? Because God is a God of mercy, abounding in steadfast love and forgiveness. He extends kindness and compassion where it is not deserved, where it is unearned and not expected. And the word for that is grace. And while laws cannot change the human heart, grace can and does. Laws may be efficient, but grace is effective. Grace moves towards the mess of our mistakes and our shortcomings with extraordinary compassion, with unexpected generosity, and with astonishing mercy. Grace changes the economy, and it changes hearts. God calls his image bearers who know him and worship him to reflect his image by being agents of grace in this hurting world. And where grace and shalom are on the increase, the circumstances driving abortion will decrease. And those who don't yet know and worship God will discover his love to be irresistibly attractive and his followers to be appealing and winsome. Grace does not name, call, or vilify people who are going to lash out in anger, pain, and disagreement. Grace doesn't shame people for their choices, their mistakes, or circumstances. Grace does not boast or rub people's noses in something they find painful. Grace instead moves towards the mess and seeks to heal, provide, and redeem. Jesus did that. Jesus entered our world and paid the price for our sin at great cost to himself. Church, the decision by the Supreme Court and the trigger laws banning abortion in Idaho do not mark the end. They mark the beginning. This decision makes the work of life-affirming clinics like Stanton Healthcare, who provide hope and resources, community and love to women facing an unplanned pregnancy. This law, this change makes those clinics more important than ever. If you support those clinics financially, if you volunteer in those places, if you give to provide resources for women facing unplanned pregnancies, now this is more important than ever. Please keep doing so. Please don't let up now. And maybe it's the time to jump in and raise your participation. This decision heightens the need for nonprofits and ministries who will address those needs that are driving abortion, that are making abortion thinkable. We saw signs recently at the rally downtown that said, "Make abortion unthinkable." Well, the reason abortion is thinkable is because the types of things that I just listed that would cause a woman to consider doing that. See, if we don't vilify someone as just wanting to murder or being a killer, but we actually stop and think, why? Let's find out what's driving this. Then we need to be able to address those things. That's shalom. This decision raises the need for legislators who continue to address the complex needs surrounding the issue. It wasn't just this one issue, there's so many issues. And so while law is not completely efficient or completely effective, there are good laws and there's lesser laws. And we need legal help. Lastly, it raises the need for families who will open their hearts and their homes to foster care and adoption so that unplanned pregnancies don't result in unloved and uncared for children. The story of the early church is church that would go and find babies who were abandoned in the dump and bring them into their homes and make them a part of their family, give them a home and a name and a family and an inheritance. That's what the church does because we vote with our lives. not just with our vote, but with our lives. Let's seek a world where women with unplanned pregnancies have an encounter with grace. Let's seek a world where their babies are born into greater shalom. This is how we hallow God's name. This is how we make the invisible God visible. And now is the time we must do it. Church, if I could encourage you as you consider this from your perspective, and again, this is a pastoral thoughts from that are limited to my experience, my understanding of God's word, and not comprehensive, and there's lots of things I'm sure I left on the table. But I want to encourage us to step towards the mess. We have a phrase that we use around here where we say, you know what, if we do this thing, that's going to get messy. If we embrace this topic, this is going to get messy. But grace calls us to move towards the mess with compassion and with mercy, and believing that God will empower us to make him visible in the world. And so, church, let's see what we can do together. Together, we've been a part of supporting Stanton's clinics and seeing free care provided for women that are experiencing those situations. Grace goes after every individual person, after every individual child. Laws are efficient because they address the big picture, but grace is effective because it goes after the person. It understands the situation. Grace gets curious about what the need is. And then grace says, even though I didn't create that need, I want to meet it. That's what Jesus did. When Jesus entered into our world, that's exactly what he did.